Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Stoa. This is Sensemaker in Residence, a part of the Sensemaker in Residence series for the month of December. We have Forrest Landry later today, Dave Fuller on Wednesday, and today we have Jordan Hall back at the Stoa. And some Stoa trivia. Jordan was the first one who basically launched the Stoa back on March 21st. That was our very first session. So very happy to have him back. I affectionately call him the General. I might have to retire that phrase. I don't think he likes it that much, but yes, very happy that he is back here. So what we're going to do is going to be a little different. It's going to be the same kind of format this session, at least. Jordan's going to share his thoughts. And if you have any questions or statements at that portion, just throw them in the chats. And then Jordan himself will call on you to unmute yourself. And I imagine he'll explain more of the protocols when I take him in. And then this will be on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that in the chats and we'll figure out how to read it on your behalf. So that being said, Jordan, welcome back to the Stoa. Okay, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, it's been a while. Wow. Whew. I have to admit right now, I'm actually a little overwhelmed. I feel there's a lot that wants to happen and it's way beyond my capacity. So I apologize if this thing flies apart several times as we're walking through it. My understanding is that we've got something like 4 sessions over the next month. Is that right, Peter? All right. So the intent that I intended to put on this, and we'll see if that's actually what wants to happen. So first and foremost, what happens happens. But at least as a provisional starting point is to endeavor to embody what John Vervaeke has been calling Dialogos, which is a particular approach to the notion of what collective intelligence and distributed cognition, meaningfully but not completely, what Benita calls collective insight, because there is actually more of a particular center, and maybe not actually, it may actually just blow into collective insight. And so the through line is that. And so as we kind of move through the arc over the next month, my request is just to maintain an attention on that, which is to say things like everybody's primary focus is tuning their own instrument and listening to the music that wants to play and learning how to participate in the collective playing of that music. In this particular circumstance, I happen to be the band leader, so it's going to sound a lot like my kind of music, at least initially. And I want to name that because I think, as many people, probably everyone here knows, I have my particular instrument oftentimes likes to play at relatively high levels of abstraction. And if that's not your mode, that's okay. Actually, the point here is to realize that when we're engaging in this collective intelligence exercise, it's the felt quality is first, and the semantics is sort of third. So don't let the semantics slow you down. If you're tuning into what's happening and I happen to be operating at a level of high abstraction and it's coming out for you in a different way, put that in the middle, and we'll figure out how to actually discern the elephant that we're all trying to perceive. And that's the hope, right? That's the intent. The concrete topic that I felt called to explore, largely because I'm actually just exploring it already anyhow, and so this is in some sense a request for assistance, a request for help to chew on something that feels timely and big, which is the future of governance, or governance as a fundamental topic. It certainly does seem timely. We'll have to see. And as always, sort of operating at least 2 levels. One level relatively more concrete and more focused on the topic that's named, and another level relatively more meta and more general purpose, which may be cut across more than just governance, but we'll not try to go too high, I think, up the stack if we don't have to. So in this particular session, it'll be a little bit like a symposium. So I'll probably spend the next 45 minutes, but I don't know if I can go that long before I get tired out, but or so laying out the cluster of concepts that have been presenting themselves to me. And then we can move into the first step of the collaborative stage, which I get the sense will look a little bit like kind of mutually pushing things into the pile in the middle, kind of like when you've poured the puzzle out on the table and everybody's grabbing pieces and looking for edges and corners. So what is the shape of this thing? What does it look like? What's missing that needs to be put in there? Stuff like that. And then we'll see how the arc evolves over the next, what is almost certain to be a interesting month in the context of governance. Okay, so now we teleport to pretty high abstraction. There's two clusters of concepts that I've really been working with over the past, oh gosh, now in some cases for 20 years, but certainly for the past 3 months. And I know they relate to each other in a very powerful way, and probably in a little bit of a Klein bottle way, meaning they're not strictly subordinate or superior, but they actually have an interesting kind of interpenetration. So one cluster I've spoken about in the past, which is the laws, norms, and code, which is a little bit like, how would you say, like temperature, ingredient, and process, or something like that. Like if you're baking something, you've got three distinct modes of how you go about cooking. Laws, norms, and codes have that same characteristic to them. I'll go into that in some detail in a moment. Then the second cluster is actually the one that's more interesting to me, but harder to get to, which is a cracking open of the classic market state false dichotomy, and the reinsertion of commons or commoning. And what then happens, by the way, is a real shift in the notion of what market and state, let's call it, really are. So what we most of the time, modern Westerners, imagine market and state to be, I would propose, is in fact a very degenerate consequence, first and foremost, of in fact having them only be in relationship with each other and not in relationship with the commons. And then when you do actually bring the commons not just in, but recognize that it's more fundamental, the other two modes shift quite substantially. And so I mean this both conceptually, but then more importantly, practically. And I think that opens up what I suspect is the primary path of what is the most both viable as well as sustainable direction for a future of governance, which is why this particular topic is so meaningful to me. Okay, so laws, norms, and code. First pass, let's go with norms. Norms are, in some sense, very easy. Norms is the sort of the field effect or the feedback loop that is oftentimes happening at the strictly hominid or mammalian level. And in fact, I would say the best thing to think about that is that it's actually grounded in that place. So when you walk into a room and you cannot help but be noticing what seems to be sort of the vibe or the appropriateness in the room. Do you feel like you're fitting in? Do you feel like you're out? What is right? What's wrong? Which is very much happening as subtle signals of rightness and wrongness that are flowing between and among people. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and so I get to watch in real time as she's playing with, absorbing, and fiddling with what is how norms actually work, at least within our family culture. And for the most part, for the vast most part, this is not explicit. For the vast most part, it's actually not even Homo sapiens, right? For the vast most part, it's mammalian and hominid. And then there's the Homo sapiens cultural specifics on top of it. So it's a big pyramid. The metaphor that I'll use to kind of hold all three of these in line is the notion of parking with your wheels turned, quote unquote, the right way on a hill. And so you park on a hill of some steep grade, and you park with your wheels turned the wrong way. In the mode of norms, someone will come up to you and tell you, you've got your wheels turned the wrong way. Now, depending on the norms of that particular culture, they may be brusque about it and tell you to get your shit straight, or they may be kind about it. It may be an elder, it may be somebody else. But the most important point is that it's very peer-to-peer. It's just sort of the notion of what people in the culture do with and for each other to support them in doing the right thing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be even a sense of violation. It could be a sense of just mistake or error. Hey, by the way, you forgot to turn your wheels in the right direction. And I use the term field effect here, and I think that's important, that there's, and I'll loop back to this point, this concept or this notion significantly in a bit, that norms have almost a sensibility in the direction of what I've called coherence or integrity, that there's a kind of when you're in a party, for example, a group of people, and things feel like they're more or less hanging together, the state or the mode of norms is quiet or okay. But when let's say somebody's getting too drunk and they're getting a little bit raucous, there's a felt sense at the level of the body that's something is getting out of whack. And I think that's the essence or the basis of norms. So then laws, we're very familiar with. And a point I would like to make is that from a historical perspective, we have been living through the great era of laws. Right? The great era of norms may in fact have terminated somewhere around the agricultural revolution, meaning that the great human prehistory was the era of norms. And then we began the movement into laws very much in direct relationship to things like writing and the ability to write down rules. And something like, say, the Constitution and the Napoleonic Code, even more so, is moving more and more in the direction of extracting governance from the mode of norms and moving it into the mode of laws. An increasingly regulatory construct. I don't know if you ever saw that famous picture of somebody standing next to a printout of like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was like a 12-foot high stack of papers to govern some very specific subset of human relations. That's laws. And so in the metaphor, you park your car and you have your wheels turned the wrong way. And in the mode of laws, there's a very specific set of formal roles. And so it's not necessarily, and in fact, it's very much not the right or responsibility of just some other person to inform you that you have parked with your wheels in the wrong way. If they do so, they're acting in the mode of norms. In the mode of laws, it would be something like the parking cop or something along those lines, who actually has the job to check and make sure that everybody's wheels are parked the right way. And there would be a formal articulation, an explicit encoding, we call it, Municipal Code 317.4, which will endeavor to enumerate in a finite set of semantics the specific qualities of this rule set. If the grade is above 4 degrees, then wheels must be turned, all that kind of nonsense. And in the mode of laws, so you've got explicit articulation of what the rule is, and an endeavor to define it with some level of precision and comprehensivity. And then formal roles, which would have to do with things like evaluation, adjudication, and enforcement. Right? So at evaluation, you might have the traffic cop who just sort of comes by, writes you the ticket. You may complain, in which case you've moved into the juridical process of assessing the state of facts and their mapping to the state of laws. And then you might be ultimately fined. And if you choose not to pay, then you'll be on the pointy end of the enforcement regime. Now, of course, different governance structures will instantiate laws differently, right? The laws may be handed down as a result of genetic lineage, and rules like who gets to create the laws and who gets to enforce the laws is based on that. We currently live in a regime where, at least ostensibly, it's associated with the notion of you vote for your representative leaders and they have legislative authority, and then judges are appointed in some certain fashion. And then the executive function appoints the evaluation and the enforcement arm, right? That's the way we've done it. And the architectures of the mode of laws and its relationship with the mode of norms over the past, 10,000 years has been a big piece of how the story of Game A has played out. So then we've got the third. The third is code. And code is actually, I think at this moment, both is the most interesting, because it's the one that is shifting the most fundamentally. So code in its earliest form would be the laws of nature. So if you park with your wheels pointed the wrong way, your car, if the brake fails, will simply roll out into the middle of the street. That's code. Right? That's something that is strictly unconscious. The human agency has nothing to do with it at all. And you can think of code as creating the boundary conditions or shaping the phase space of choice, irrespective of choice itself. And that's a pretty fundamental definition of code. However, and of course, technology itself feeds back on nature. And so technology changes code, right? So we once had in our code that human beings could not travel through the air. And then, of course, technology changed that such that human beings can travel through the air. And that entered into a whole new regime of norms and laws on how one behaves when you're traveling through the air as a human being. Now, at the sort of the point in the exponential technology acceleration curve, code is becoming more and more a part of the way we actually modulate governance. And here I point specifically to something known as the Internet of Things, which is going to become more and more and more important, whether that's dystopian or not. And it may very well be very extremely dystopian. So the metaphor there would be your car. Let's make it a self-driving car to really make it work. Your car pulls up to the curb, and the software inside the car causes the car to notice that it's on a grade, and therefore to execute a subroutine that turns the wheels in the direction that was coded into the architecture at the moment of its creation, or at least in its most recent push update from the cloud. So the human in this case has nothing to do with it. The human simply gets into and out of the car. And that's code. Now notice, when we take code as being the laws of nature, we humans are simply reacting to what happens to be the laws of nature. But in this more recent formulation, somebody somewhere wrote those rules. Right? So there's a form of a massive, very important, crucial form of human agency, which now becomes, in many ways, the most important piece of the future of governance, which is who is code written. Because now code begins to define everything. To maybe put it in a more concrete sensibility, it's funny, long ago, I think maybe in 1990, maybe a little bit later, I read a short written piece called The Postscript on the Societies of Control by a Frenchman named Gilles Deleuze. And in it, he more or less predicted the future in a eerily accurate way. And one of the things he talked about was the flows of divisuals modulated in space. And the example here would be something like what's going on in China with social credit scores. And so you have, imagine that you live in a world where you have some sort of biometric identity. It could be mechanical in the sense that you have some sort of armband that you wear. It could be synthetic in the sense that your voice print and face print are your identity. But the point is that you have a biometric identity that an Internet of Things, a omnipresent technology that's watching you all over the place, can track. And your state, for example, your social credit score, modulates what doors open and what doors don't open. So if you're sort of above 800, you're allowed to go into the mall and buy stuff. If you're below 800, that door just simply won't open for you. Those are the kinds of things that begin to happen in the context of the era of code, which we have now begun to really enter into. Okay. And just to kind of throw something out there, this doesn't fit quite right, but it's maybe useful. In the era of laws, a concept that sort of represented the notion of what good law was the notion of justice. So the notion of justice represents the degree to which the articulation, adjudication, and enforcement function of law is felt to be good, right, in some way. And the more people who feel it's good, the more the felt sense of justice pervades the community. In the era of code, or specifically in the mode of code, I would propose that the equivalent is something more like design. So that well-designed codes is coordinated with just laws, something like that. And then in the case of norms, I don't actually have the right term. Maybe it's healthy, like healthy community or something like that. But just to kind of hold on to that, that when we actually enter into these three different modes being now consciously applied and noticing how each one relates to the other and what's their coordination with each other, right? Not just independently, but actually what's the whole that contains them. We now have to think about what's the notion of what is like right relationship and good balance between and among all three. So how does justice feed back on design, and how does design feed back on justice, and how does health feed back on both? Something like that. Okay, so that's the first. Okay. So the second cluster, as you'll notice, is definitely related, but it's related in a very odd way. And if the first is almost like at the level of fundamental modes, the second is more like institutions, so more like tools. And here there seems to be three distinct tools, although it may not be strictly three. It's definitely not two, but it may be more than three. Historically, we've seen state and market, and now I'm going to introduce the commons. Now, the first thing I noticed when I was beginning the process of contemplating this and having conversations about it is that many people were confused about the notion of the commons as symmetric conceptually to market and state. That the commons has oftentimes certainly for the last 100 or 200 years, been thought of as the object of governance, not the subject of governance, i.e. that we need to use the state to prevent the tragedy of the commons, right? Or we need to assign private property rights so that the commons are, or whatever. Sorry, that can't possibly work, can it? It's almost antithetical, but you get it, right? The idea is that the commons is an object. The commons is sort of like the land that isn't owned by the state or the market, but we need to use these modes of governance, the market and the state, to govern the commons. Right? It's an object of governance. And the proposition that I would make is that is in fact precisely the error, that commoning, CF, common law, is in fact a mode of governance, and is in fact the more fundamental mode of governance. And it may coordinate very, very closely with norms. And so these may be sort of two different ways of looking at a very similar, the same thing. But let me see if I can do a little bit more to map these things out a little bit. What do I mean by commoning or the commons? So some examples of things that are in the commons at the level of object that are not often considered or not always considered to be in the commons would be something like language. So the shared language, the shared resource that in some sense nobody owns and everybody uses is a very important commons. Collective sense making, the ability to tell the truth and orient towards what is true in collaboration with each other is a commons. Certainly, obviously, things like the oceans and the atmosphere are also commons, but also, say, for example, the Amazon, which is very interesting. In some very important sense, the Amazon is both the place where the indigenous peoples of the Amazon live and the sort of the lungs of the atmosphere. Right? And so the notions of the commons includes many overlapping what some people would refer to as a claim or a relationship with. So I have a relationship with the Amazon as part of a commons, and then somebody who lives in Ecuador has a relationship with the Amazon as part of the commons. They may be both, and there may be many, right? That person in Ecuador may have 5 or 6 distinct claims on that same object. But the question is, how might we resolve those claims using the mode of commoning, not the mode of state and not the mode of market? And a fundamental proposition I would make is that a catastrophic error for the past 150 years, at least, if not more, is that the endeavor to manage the claims on the commons using either the market or the state or both creates havoc. It creates a disaster. Neither the market nor the state is in fact the proper governance mechanism for the commons. And it is largely through the rediscovery and the revivification of commoning as the proper governance mechanism for the commons, that we can in fact regenerate the commons, all of the commons. And then what actually happens, which is very interesting, is that allows the market and the state to settle back, to release things that were never theirs in the first place, and therefore settle back into a much more subtle and stable location that they're more appropriately able to handle. This relates, so here I'll do is I'll kind of loop back to the first. This relates also to the notion of laws, norms, and code. Laws have been pushed way, actually, the more I think about it, the more I'm astounded by how far beyond their capacity laws have been pushed. We're living in the sort of in this massively hypertrophied legal regime where laws are pushed to try to do stuff they couldn't possibly do. The emergence of code as a conscious modality, and the building skillfulness in design will release an extraordinary amount of responsibility and will allow laws, like something like 90% of laws, will simply evaporate because they will no longer be needful. And it will actually, I think, also reawaken norms to a very large extent. So what I would propose is that we will see in the evolution or the migration of governance is that in some sense we will see a significant expansion in the conscious awareness of the role of code. As code begins to hold more and more responsibility, we will see a somewhat massive, and I said like 90%, somewhat massive reduction in the scope and responsibility of laws. But also we will see a meaningful increase in the scope and responsibility of norms. And there will be much more of a sense of symmetry or balance between the three modes than we've seen perhaps ever. And then if I flip back again, I apologize, and I'll probably stop talking after this because I feel like I've run out of useful things to say for the moment. Something similar happening in the other cluster, so that as we reawaken and rediscover ways of going about commoning as a form of governance, this will release enormously the amount of burden that's being carried right now, particularly by the state, and allow things to shift a lot, massively actually. So maybe I'll kind of drop down a level of concretion. So that was all happening at a pretty high level of abstraction of more or less pure concepts and their relationships to each other. If I take this jumping off point and drop down, what I would propose is that in this new relationship, the content of the state, that the legislative function will almost entirely evaporate. That if you think about it, if laws are going away in a big way, like reducing by a factor of 90%, then the legislative function, as it turns out, was actually, it is a primary hypertrophy, meaning it's vastly more, takes up vastly more of our time and energy than would be appropriate. And that the state becomes much, much less about the coding of law or the writing of laws, the crafting of laws, and then their evaluation, adjudication, and enforcement. And much, much more about just adjudication. So I would actually say that adjudication, perhaps, and probably adjudication and enforcement end up being the natural thing that lies at the center of the state. And that for the most part, the content of the boundaries on behavior that we interact with on a day-to-day basis will live in some combination between norms and code. And that if you run into something at the level of laws, this is because something has significantly has broken, and this will actually be called into a mode of adjudication. And so I would put like at the adjective, say, for example, wisdom might map to the state, which is a very interesting prospect to be thinking about that it's at the level of the collective awareness of the necessity of listening into what kinds of innovative relationships need to actually be brought to bear would be happening in that thing that has been held by the state for some very long time. So notice right here, I'm very much pointing to the need for a Nietzschean hammer around the notion of the state, that the idea of the state that we've been living with for a very long time, perhaps for thousands of years, is quite wrong and needs to be smashed. And then inside of that, we will see like this sort of like curled up fetus that is the actual thing that should have been living in that place, that will be called wisdom. And that it's the sort of a kicking up in some sense. It's like, hey, whoa, something is off. Like our ordinary modes of navigating life seem not to be working right now. Can we slow down a little bit and invoke an inquiry or calling into wisdom, where there's a deep inquiry into what's up in the world, what's up with us, what's going on? Has something happened where the context of the world has so changed that our norms and our code are no longer adequately or effectively mapping to reality? Do we need to actually be more explicit about articulating some change and then allowing that change to then percolate through our norms and our code to then create a new support structure that can hold reality as it is? You know, that would be sort of the state in this future. Explicit, highly conscious, like consciousness itself, living at that place. And then obviously being in relationship with maturity, living at the level of the commons. Right? So at the level of the commons, the notion of being able to have a conversation with somebody else and being able to sort of have a very mature conversation. Say, oh yeah, I get it. You know, me cutting down all the trees in your rainforest doesn't work for you. And yet also we tend to build all of our abodes out of trees. So we need to find some way of actually resolving what are two mutually incompatible circumstances. Everybody needs to have a place to live, and your rainforest needs to not be destroyed. How do we solve that problem as mature people interacting with each other? Which, as we've noticed, sort of neither Marcus nor State seems to have even as part of their basic portfolio of behavior. And then we get back down to code, which is something like, okay, we kind of have a sense of how things ought to work. It seems pretty clear. How do we now design this elegantly into some sort of architecture that makes it super, super easy? And if it turns out that there are errors, that we just throw errors elegantly so that people can consciously observe where the errors are, something like that. Okay, that's that. I'm done now. Thank you for listening. That was very helpful.